In the early 20th century, railroad axles rode on what were known as friction-bearing bogies. These bearings were made of brass journals that rolled in place. These were lubricated via grease and cotton packing. After a good amount of miles, these grease cotton packs would have to be replaced periodically, much like how your automobile needs its oil changed every 3,000 miles to keep its engine running smoothly. Failure to do this, though, would cause the bearing to overheat, and a telltale sign of this would be smoke or flames pouring out of the journal box, causing what's known as a hotbox, which when spotted, the train would be forced to stop and the crew would have to hunt down the hotbox in question to put the fire out and try to cool the bearing. However, if a hotbox persists long enough, it can seize the bearing, locking up the axle, which can break, causing a derailment. And in some cases, like at Frankfurt Junction in Philadelphia, it can have grave consequences.
On Labor Day, September 6, 1943, Pennsylvania Railroad train number 152, the Congressional Limited, was running on its over 236-mile journey from Union Station in Washington, D.C. to Pennsylvania Station in New York City, averaging speeds of 80 miles per hour, making many stops along the way, such as Wilmington, Delaware, North Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey, Perryville, Maryland, Baltimore, Penn, and more. The train consisted of GG1 electric locomotive number 4930, 8 P70 class coaches, 1 kitchen car, 1 dining car, 4 Pullman parlor cars, 1 sleeper, and 1 parlor lounge car. Over 541 passengers and crew were on board that afternoon. Everything appeared normal at first as the train left the skyline of Philadelphia behind, accelerating up to speed. By about 6 p.m., the train was passing by North Philadelphia Station and was actually running ahead of schedule. But all that was about to change. As it passed the Frankfurt Junction yard in the Kensington district, workers spotted flames coming from a journal box on the 7th car, P70 class number 1860. It was the clear sign of a hot box. Knowing disaster was likely imminent, they ran the next signal tower at Frankfurt Junction, warning him to try and flag down the Congressional, hoping to have it stop before the situation got worse. But unfortunately, before the tower man could even react,
The journal box on the front of the 7th car, 1860, had seized and an axle snapped, catching the underside of the truck and catapulting the car upwards. It struck a signal gantry, which peeled off its roof along the line of windows like a can of sardines, as described by witnesses. The 8th car, P70 class number 3941, wrapped itself around the gantry upright in a U-shape. The next 6 cars were scattered, piling on top of the wreckage, while the last 2 cars remained undamaged and were lucky to not end up in the logjam. The head end continued for some distance, only to be stopped by the emergency brakes applying as the air hoses between the 6th and 7th cars ripped apart, dumping the air for the brakes, forcing the train to stop. All the engineer and some passengers could do was look back and witness the horror behind them unfold. As it was the middle of the Second World War, many servicemen home on leave were aboard the train and helped the injured as best they could. Workers from the nearby Cramps shipyard, who heard and witnessed the crash, also arrived armed with acetylene torches and wasted no time using them to cut open the mangled cars to rescue the injured, a process that took until the following morning, even as the first rescuers descended on the scene from all across the Philadelphia area. When the rescue operations concluded, 79 passengers had perished in the wreck, all from the 7th and 8th cars. 117 others were injured, some of them seriously. One of the survivors on board was Chinese author Lin Yutong.
As the investigation into the wreck began, conducted by the Interstate Commerce Commission, it soon became clear that the wreck was a classic case of a hotbox, as this wasn't the first time a hotbox derailed a train. The first documented case of a hotbox goes all the way back to November 8th of 1833, when a Camden and Amboy train suffered a hotbox and derailed near Cranberry, New Jersey, killing 2 and injuring 21, including famous businessman and future New York Central President Cornelius Vanderbilt. Ever since then, measures to ensure that journal boxes were well lubricated were gradually introduced into railroading up to that point, even in 1943. Railroad mechanics on the Pennsylvania Railroad who had inspected and lubricated the exact journal box on the car in question, P-70 class number 1860, earlier that day, swore that it had been in good order. Normal practice back in those days was for signal towermen to keep an eye on the wheels of passing trains for any signs of trouble, and for train crewmen to occasionally look back as their trains rounded curves. When one train passed another train, crewmen would do a visual roll-by, keeping an eye on the consist, letting the other train crew know of any signs of trouble. On freight trains, you'd also have a brakeman or conductor in the caboose sitting high up in the cupola to get a good view of the train from the rear and to radio the head end as soon as he spotted or smelled a hotbox or anything else that could be wrong with the train. How such a hotbox slipped past detection long enough to cause this accident remains a mystery, but it likely started when no one was looking, or the shop forces were lying to cover their tracks. But unfortunately, we can't be 100% certain, especially considering the technology available back then, as who knows how long the hotbox was going on before the wreck. Either way, measures to eliminate such issues were already being introduced long before the accident. The Timken company came up with a revolutionary idea, basically getting rid of the lubrication altogether, by having the bearings float on a cushion of rollers. This kind of technology dated back centuries ago, being used in several applications with primitive materials like wood, seeing use on ships, marine timekeepers, and even Leonardo da Vinci's conceptual helicopter design. Over time, after metal and steel making became more practical, the roller bearing concept would help lead the way in the Industrial Revolution. On railroads, roller bearings not only made maintenance a hell of a lot easier, but they mostly eliminate the threat of a hotbox altogether, as the roller bearings practically lubricate themselves. Not only that, roller bearing axles could go on for more than twice as many miles before needing serious service or replacement compared to that of a journal box. The only way you could get a hotbox on a roller bearing car was if you left the handbrake on as the train moved, the chain for said handbrake is tight from not being released properly, sticky brakes that won't release, brake pressure issues, poor maintenance, etc. Basically silly stuff, but nothing to do with the lack of lubrication of the bearings. The Santa Fe Railroad was the first to be sold on the idea, applying it to their passenger cars around the 1930s, with very positive feedback from both passengers and crew. Had the P-70 cars in question on the Congressional had roller bearings instead, the accident likely would have never happened. Timken would promote the idea even further by contracting the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO for short, to build the Timken 1111, or Four Aces locomotive, to tour across railroads of the Northeast, including the Pennsylvania Railroad, to prove that roller bearings were the future. But that's a story for another video. The implementation of such a technology was very gradual over the 20th century and significantly changed railroad history compared to other technologies such as positive train control and the end-of-train device. The Pennsylvania Railroad would also embrace this change, with many new-build passenger cars being fitted with roller bearing stock, and some older coaches being refitted with rollers instead of their journal boxes. However, if you look hard enough on tourist roads today, you'll still find some passenger and freight cars sporting journal boxes, but Class 1 railroads would ban interchanging with journal box cars after the 1980s. Also, many technologies such as defect detectors would start showing up in the late 80s and early 90s that could detect hotboxes and other issues such as dragging equipment to further prevent such accidents.
Let's go right. Track 1. First, hotbox. South side. Axle 1. 0.
As soon as a critical defect like this was relayed by the detector, the train must stop and the conductor must walk up the train to look for the axle in question, diagnose the problem, and work out a solution. If the conductor finds out it was a false alarm, the train continues as is. If the detector issues a
detector not working,
unless it's not a key train, that is a train carrying more than 5 hazardous materials, the train should still stop and the conductor must do a visual roll-by checking for any defects. After the accident, GG1 4930, having been undamaged from the accident, returned to service, serving the Pennsylvania Railroad, Penn Central, and later Amtrak under lease until being retired and scrapped after 1980. While the Congressional Limited would fade into the history books, being canceled in 1971 after the formation of Amtrak, trains, both freight and passenger, still roll by Frankfort Junction today. But 71 years and 8 months later, another disaster would occur. On May 12, 2015, Amtrak Northeast Regional number 188 derailed near the exact same spot the Congressional derailed earlier, coincidentally going the same direction, killing 8 and injuring over 200, 11 of them being critical. This time, the cause was overspeed due to the engineer losing situational awareness of where he was after being distracted by his radio. However, this too is another story. Fast forwarding all the way to modern day, 80 years later, axle bearings would receive new attention when Norfolk Southern train number 32N derailed in East Palestine, Ohio on the Fort Wayne line, coincidentally an ex-Pennsylvania Railroad main line, spilling and igniting many hazardous flammable chemicals like vinyl chloride, isobutylene, butyl acrylic, and benzene. While the cause of the accident is still under investigation, with numerous news reports surrounding it, many of them being fueled by misinformation and even flat-out propaganda, a few amateur videos, including one from a doorbell camera, shows flames shooting out from a hopper's axle bearings in Salem, Ohio, 20 miles from the crash site, a telltale sign of a hotbox. Defect detectors were supposedly tripped about the issue until the final one went off at milepost 49.8 in East Palestine, 30 seconds before the train derailed. As said before, the accident is still under investigation, as only a preliminary report has surfaced so far from the NTSB, leaving many to speculate about the accident and making many begin to question about the safety of railroads today.
Norfolk Southern is laying out a 6-point safety plan that includes things like better inspection and detection systems to prevent future incidents.
I'll still be keeping an eye out on the axles or the train itself to see if there's anything amiss.
The train enthusiast we spoke with says he believes some people take trains for granted, and this latest incident is a reminder for people to educate themselves about train safety and guidelines.
They don't realize how railroads have opened up the country all these years ago, and they take it for granted.
Nichols says people need to ask more questions about what's rolling through their own backyards.
Why are we sending through so many dangerous fuels and goods through our local towns when they've been doing this for so many years?
Could it be possible these two accidents, 80 years apart from each other, could be related? While both are similar in how they occurred, it's highly unlikely, as one was from a journal box not being lubricated, and the other could be anything at this point since it's a roller bearing, so we can't say for sure. We know what happened, we just don't know why. But I'd say it's best to wait until official findings are released, and quite frankly, that's for the best. As for the congressional victims, it's best to save that bickering for later. and like the victims of this incident, rest in peace.